Hello, 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 hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yonis Hassan. I'd like to thank you all for joining us at this important panel discussion. I'm the CEO of Justice Fund Toronto, and today I'll be the host of this discussion. And before we get into our very, very exciting discussion, I wanted to start by acknowledging that I am here in Toronto, sacred land that is the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga of the Credits. And that this territory is covered by the Dish with one screw wampum belt covenant. We think it's important to start any conversation on this land by acknowledging the many nations of Indigenous people who are presently living on this land and those that have spent time here and the ancestors who have hunted and gathered on this land. I also want to acknowledge the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought here against their will, and made to work on these lands. At FoodShare, we believe that advancing Indigenous sovereignty is deeply and inextricably linked to Black liberation, and we're committed to advancing both. As we think about moving land acknowledgements from words to action, I invite you all to take a moment to reflect on the land that you are situated on, and those of you who are settlers to consider how you can advance the mending of relations in your own lives. See, the audio might be cutting in and out, so let me just move a bit closer. I also wanted to make a few notes on the logistics for this event. For the closed captions, please click the CC icon on the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles. Thank you to Christy and Amina for providing ASL interpretation. You can hide the non-video participants and pin Christy and Amina square to ensure that they are visible throughout the event. As we have lots of questions prepared, there will not be any Q&As for this discussion, but please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and engage in the discussion. I know I'll be jumping in and out of the chat. This event will be recorded and posted on FoodShare's YouTube channel with closed captioning for those of you who want to revisit the conversation or share it with those who are unable to join today. And with that, I would like to introduce our three amazing, outstanding, fantastic, phenomenal panelists for the day. First up is Germaine Catchpole. Germaine is the Anishinaabe from Lac Seul First Nations, Territory 3, with relations with Serpent River First Nation. She's worked with a number of fundraising roles for Indigenous-led organizations and non-Indigenous-led organizations, as well as managing her own small food business called Manupcook Preserves. Next, I'd like to introduce Janine Manning. Janine is an Anishinaabe and member of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation who lives and works in Toronto with her son. Janine is the manager of the annual giving and donor relations at Anishinaabe Health Foundation and is the first Indigenous person to serve as the president of a private foundation, Laidlaw Foundation, in Canada that is not Indigenous-led. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Kris Archie. Kris is a mother, an auntie, an engaged community member, holding me accountable as well. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Circle on Philanthropy. And I'd like to thank you all for being here, and let's dive into this really exciting and important conversation. I make a lot of jokes, so don't mind me. First of all, to all the panelists, I'd like to start off by grounding in a few questions for this conversation today. First, tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you came to the role that you're in relation to philanthropy and fundraising. And it'd be really good to hear about what made you want to participate in today's discussion about navigating settler philanthropy. Kris, I'll start with you, and I'll ask you to
kick us off.
Kick us off, because the terminology settler philanthropy is something that's rooted in your organization and something that you guys are leading forward in Canada. So please, Kris.
Thank you, Yonis. Wake and wake. Hello, everyone. Kris Archie and Squest, equipment to Galmuch from Teskin. Get to hear the trains. An ongoing demonstration of how colonization is impacting this land where I'm joining you from. How did I end up at the circle? I mean, I think that's a really fun conversation that probably takes more time than folks are going to be interested in listening in. But ultimately, I'm really fortunate to have this unbroken connection to my home community and have been taught I've had a life that's been enriched by my worldviews as a Secwepemc woman. Um, in terms of being in service and being accountable to communities and doing what I can to be of service to people. And so it kind of is a natural segue into entering into a place where I can have some transformational systems change opportunity alongside settlers, alongside other equity seeking communities to create some change. I've been now at the circle for about 5 years, and I'm really have been really enjoying witnessing the shift in language, the shift in conception, and most importantly, seeing an increased shift in power related to decision making and authority in the philanthropic sector. So I'm really delighted about that. As you mentioned, we use some really specific language because when usually folks in the Canadian context talk about philanthropy, what they think is rich people giving money to poor people. Or they think they're talking about traditional philanthropy is family foundations, corporate foundations, or community foundations. And we needed a way to bring into the conversation multiple generations of the ethical stewardship of resources and the redistribution of wealth that Indigenous peoples across these lands have been participating in and upholding the laws and teachings of since the beginning of time. So that's why we do what we can to be very clear when we're talking about settler philanthropy that is built on the lands and the backs of Indigenous peoples in this place, or we're talking about Indigenous philanthropy, which is deeply in relationship to land, to kin, and to the accountabilities, teachings, and laws of Indigenous people. So I was really excited to be on this panel because being able to have a conversation with two other strong Indigenous women is something I don't get a chance to do very often. So thankful for that. Kuksham.
Janine, you wanted to go introduce yourself and tell us a little bit why you're interested in participating in today's discussion.
Yeah, like Kris, I have some background music. Mine is thunder. It is pouring here. I actually have the pleasure of zooming in from my traditional territory and not from Toronto, where I normally am and live. So I just want to acknowledge my traditional territory, which is the territory of the Anishinaabe Nation and the people of the Three Fires. So that is the Potawatomi, the Odawa. And excuse me, I'm nervous. I don't know why. It's because I had some technical difficulties leading up to joining everyone here today. So I'm just trying to find my grounding, and the thunder and lightning is not helping because it's giving me the jump scares. So yeah, just back to my acknowledgement. So this territory is the territory of the Three Fires, known as the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. And I want to give thanks to my relatives and my relations who are from the Chippewas of Nawash and our neighbors, the Chippewas of the Saugeen, who are stewards of this land, which we collectively share and call the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. So I'm so excited to share and join you from this territory. So my name is Oshke Anang Kwe, which means New Star Woman. And so, like I was introduced, I typically live in Toronto. Nation and Gaming and Donjaba is where I'm from, also known as Chippewas of Nawash or Cape Croker. I'm from the Bear Clan, Makwadotum, and I'm Anishinaabe. So thank you for having me. That's a little bit about myself as an Indigenous person and where I am, just to ground myself with those words. And the roles I have in philanthropy, I'm kind of set up in a very unique position in that I work for an Indigenous-led charity or foundation, and we are the fundraising entity for the Indigenous Health Center in Toronto, known as Anishinaabe Health Toronto. And then I also volunteer as the president or chair. We've just recently updated our ONCA laws to reflect the modernization of that, those laws, of the Laidlaw Foundation. And apparently, I'm told, I didn't look into this, other people did, that I'm the first to chair a private philanthropic organization in Canada. And I wanted to make sure that in that bio that you guys shared with the public, that we emphasize that it's a non-Indigenous organization, because I do know there are Indigenous family and private foundations out there. So obviously they would be headed by Indigenous folks of those families or those communities. So I don't want to take away space from that. So how I got into philanthropy, much like many other folks in this sector, it was purely by accident. In 2016 or 17, I can't remember, I entered into a role with the Ontario Arts Council and became a manager of a public granting program. And so wanting to learn best practices with granting with and for Indigenous folks, I started volunteering with other philanthropic and granting organizations. And, you know, one of them was Laidlaw. So I had served with them on the granting committee for 3 years before being nominated as president of the foundation. And what I found was volunteering with Laidlaw and other organizations is that I was coming, hoping to learn best practices for granting with equity-seeking groups, in particular Indigenous communities. And what I ended up doing was sharing wise practices instead. So yeah, I love it. I geek out about granting programs and applications. And so here I am.
We're going to get right into that, Janine. I just want to pass it off to Germaine before we do quick wrap up the introductions and we get right into the meaty questions. Germaine?
Hi, everyone. Germaine Indigenous cause, Obishko King, Ndonjiba, Atik and Dodam. So I'm Germaine. I'm from Lac-Seul First Nation. I'm a member of the Caribou clan. I'm also a little bit nervous. I don't know why, because I'm just talking about myself, but I have relations in Serpent River First Nation. So a lot of my family's from there. I have family on Manitoulin Island. So I come from giant families, but very proud to be from the North, from Treaty 3. Yes, for sure. How did I end up in this work? It's kind of funny because my first program, I had taken program in community development. And during that time, a lot of my teachers had said to me that I should go into social work, that I should become a social worker or do frontline work or become a mental health counselor. So it kind of set you up to go into university. And I realized that's not for me. That's not something that I know I wouldn't be cut out for. I got my own stuff is what I thought. But I knew that I really wanted to work with, I wanted to contribute to community somehow. So what I had ended up doing was I had looked into different postgraduate programs, and I took a postgraduate program in fundraising and resource development. And I thought, well, fundraising, that's probably easy, which is not easy work whatsoever. But there's a lot of value in that program, but I've also done a lot of unlearning at the same time. Yeah, so that's me. Another thing that I want to say, just to also ground myself, is I'm only speaking for myself. I don't speak for all Indigenous people. I don't speak for my community. It's just speaking for myself. Miigwech.
And thank you all. Let's get into the first question. Let's jump right into it. I personally think that philanthropy, particularly settler Canadian philanthropy, is rooted in exploitation, extraction, and genocide of Indigenous communities. But Janine, conversations around decolonizing wealth and philanthropy are often centered around private foundations and granting, spaces where conversations around reciprocity, may be challenging, but possible. Another source of funding that organizations depend on is contributions from individual donors. Can you speak to the unique challenges and maybe opportunities of individual gift programs? And yes, no need to be nervous because you're all amongst friends. Just muted.
What I was saying was that I turned off the gallery view, so that helps a lot. It's just us four and the raging thunder outside my window now. So I totally blew over my head the first part of your question. The second part I know was about fundraising, challenges and opportunities. So it's hard to really sum up what challenges and opportunities there are in sectors because, you know, like individuals, corporate and private family foundations are so different, right? My experiences with Laidlaw Foundation, and I don't want to, you know, celebrate us too loudly because I know that we can always grow more, we can always do more, we can always, you know, encourage more growth in the sector. What we're doing some, you know, a lot of unlearning, like Germaine said, a lot of learning. And I feel like every year we're getting a little bit more, not progressive, but we're growing more. We're being more inclusive. We're being more conscious of who we are, of what kind of space we take up, but we're also conscious of the platforms we have and the networks we have and the conversations that we can have to encourage folks to be more inclusive of, you know, non-qualified donees, youth, justice movements. You know, I don't think I'm having as many difficult conversations, but I do know that, you know, as someone who's Indigenous, as someone who is not your typical president or chair of a private foundation, that I do have my competencies questioned. I question them myself because I'm not from, you know, that world. And so for me, there's opportunity for the private foundations to, you know, set tones and cultures to be more inclusive. I can tell you that I could not do the work I do with Laidlaw Foundation if it wasn't for the individuals who create the welcoming space. You know, you can only set so much in policy and governance. It's really about the people that are holding space for you, who are sitting beside you, that matter the most, because words on paper can just be that. It's the people that really, you know, create the environment for you to thrive and be accepted and be your whole self in. And I'm so thankful that the Laidlaw governance, I have that mostly. For the fundraising, there is a lot of talk in our sector about, you know, the policies and the laws and the governance and how we can, you know, decolonize wealth through philanthropy and private and corporate giving. And I find we need to have more conversations about fundraising and opportunities that exist there with individuals because, you know, statistically, I know this is true for our foundation, where I work, is that, you know, the majority of our funding comes from individual donors, annual plans, monthly donors, yearly donors, not from philanthropic donors, not from corporate donors. And so the collective wealth of individuals in Canada is $11 trillion compared to the 90 billion in the private foundation sector. So I think that there's so much opportunity there to have individuals learn and grow with us. And that's something I'm embarking on with the Anishinaabe Health Foundation is, you know, moving beyond this transactional relationship of, you know, donor and recipient and creating relationships of respect and responsibility and reciprocity. And I don't want to take up too much time and space to talk about some of the initiatives that we've introduced, but you know, it's very exciting. I see a lot of folks in recent times, you know, wanting to support more, wanting to be positive, you know, donors, and a lot less of the, the negative, demanding, donor-centric, ways. I'm seeing a shift. I'm feeling a shift of folks wanting to be a part of the community-centric model of fundraising. So that's those are some really exciting opportunities, I think, that are coming ahead for Indigenous-led organizations and Indigenous fundraisers who support them.
Absolutely, and you're right, leadership matters. Shout out to Jihad, Layla, and next question is to Kris. Kris, language does matter in this sector. It's what we hold ourselves accountable with, but it's also what we hold our funders and the philanthropic sector accountable with. So can you speak a little bit about some of the languages that you had to fill, that you had to learn from the philanthropic / fundraising sector as an Indigenous person, and what else has changed between working actively in the sector and from an Indigenous-led perspective?
Well, off the top, I talked about the difference that we try and create space for understanding settler philanthropy and Indigenous philanthropy. And what I hope is that there's more and more conversations where folks from other equity-seeking communities are amplifying, holding up, and acknowledging their own practices of generosity and reciprocity. I think the social fabric of the place we live in is enriched when we all can show up with the teachings and the values and the worldviews related to redistribution of wealth and how we build community and stay accountable to our communities through sharing economies. I also just wanted to say this little piece. I get on a soapbox about decolonizing, and there is this desire for folks to be in this like, oh, we're going to decolonize philanthropy, and I always bristle when people want to talk about decolonizing a grant system, decolonizing an organization, because I think you can talk a lot about it, you can read a lot about it, but I want folks to have an embodied experience of what does it feel like to truly think and do things differently. And that requires time, and it requires people to be fully present, not just here in a screen, but also present in our body, present to our history, present to our truth, present to our discomfort. And so I think more than just the words that I've had to, delete from my vocabulary, like reconciliation, one of the words I just don't bother with, is actually to try and find opportunities to cultivate spaces where people actually feel differently. Because I really believe that if we create opportunities for folks to feel a way, then in the work that they do in the world, they can return back to, you know what, I think there's another way to be in this, and I can feel myself back into that way of being. And the other piece is just that we are all harmed by white supremacy. We are all harmed by patriarchy and misogyny and racism. And so when we create an opportunity to find some sense of healing and some depth of feeling in our bodies, I think we create an environment where more and more people want to go back to it. They'll return to it. And so like Janine said, of the top 10 issues Canadians donate to, Indigenous is last on the list. I would say that largely folks feel like they don't know where to give, right? So we try and do what we can to highlight and amplify where to give. But additionally, the narrative in this country is that Indigenous peoples, they get everything for free. They're already taken care of. They're not our problem. They're someone else's problem. And funny enough, someone else is the government. We just, forget that we vote the government. And, so there's all this distancing. And what I love about the work that's happening now in the sector is, with contributions of fantastic folks like Germaine and Janine and so many others who are on this call, who are also in the audience, there is an undeniable sense. Not only are we fantastic recipients for building on amazing projects and for transforming the country that we're in and the nations and the lands that we're occupying, we also can help things get better for others. The generations, the multiple generations of wisdom and knowledge actually has a benefit for us all. And I think that that's a really beautiful opportunity. So in terms of language, the one last thing I would just say is how much I enjoy being able to be in panel conversations, to use my own language, to hear the language of other Indigenous folks speaking. And I really just encourage anyone who's working in the sector to use your own languages. If you are fortunate enough to have them, use your mother languages as often as you can, because the beauty, the meaning behind those words can, I think, have a positive impact for all of us in this work.
Absolutely. And Germaine, I wanted to come to you around the same conversation around language. I am a recovering and liberated fundraiser. And in the philanthropic sector or the fundraising world, there's a lot of languages that we use. And as someone who studied fundraising and is actively working in the sector, what has been different, do you think, about fundraising for an Indigenous-led organization, particularly using language as well?
Yeah, I was thinking about what Kris had said about using our own languages. There's a lot of terminology in fundraising, and of course, having studied it, that some of it doesn't sit well with me. So words like solicitation, like that doesn't align with my identity and who I am as an Anishinaabe woman. And also, I've been really mindful lately about words like even donors, even that word donor, right? And trying to shift my language to supporters, because it really should be more of a partnership, and just trying to, just being really aware that, language matters, language can help shift power dynamics. So that's been a good learning for me. And yeah, I guess there was something else I wanted to say about that, and of course I lost it. But I guess it's just really thinking about ways that how you can engage in this work while also protecting your spirit. Yeah.
Thank you. This question is to all the panelists. Can I say something?
Oh yeah, of course.
Kris just got me. Kris mentioned some things about, relationship building and taking time and stuff. And one of the challenges of being a professional fundraiser is timing, right? You have that capital build, and the government says, we're going to give you X amount of $1 million, and if you want that money, you got to give us $10 million by this deadline, right? There is no time in the fundraising, profession and framework to build those relationships that our communities, are striving for. And it's just go, 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 right? It's really high pace. It's really competitive. Fundraisers, they're headhunters. Like, they go out there and they find it, and they got to get it before someone else. And it's a really complicated profession to be in when you're trying to ground yourself, as we do as Indigenous people, in who we are, in where we are, and through relationship building, right? So I just wanted to point that out. And the other thing Kris said about folks saying, oh, Indigenous people, the stereotype that Indigenous people get things for free. I'm a fundraiser for a health center. And so one of the challenges is, well, doesn't the government pay for your health center? Don't you have that covered by the government? I can tell you that the Western programs, the physiotherapy, the Western doctor, the GP practitioner, or the chiropodist maybe, but what we don't have funded are our traditional healers, our traditional medicines, our ceremonies. And so there is no funding in the government's definition of what health and healthcare is, or what our actual health and healthcare models are for our community. So our foundation exists to support the health center for all those, what folks would call additionals, for us to be who we are, and to access our culture and our ceremonies, our healers and our teachers. That's not funded by the government. The government and their policies are the reasons those were stripped from us. And so why would they fund for us to, you know, reconnect or re-access it? So I just wanted to point that out. You know, one of the things that we don't get funding for, and I can tell you, I was the program manager in the Ontario Arts Council, and it was a $5 million a year funding to revitalize culture and language in Ontario for Indigenous folks. The first thing that our Conservative Premier did, one of the first anti-Indigenous moves was cut that program, because that mindset doesn't fund, they fund assimilation projects. They don't fund culture reconnection projects. So, when you're supporting Indigenous-led organizations, what you're actually supporting is for the reconnection and the reparations from the fallout of residential school. If you want to call it reconciliation, sure, but like Kris said, that's not really, I'm not comfortable with the word either, just like Kris, but yeah, that's kind of how I feel as a fundraiser for an Indigenous organization, is that this work is helping the community to reclaim what, I don't say lost, because we didn't lose anything, what was stolen from us. Whether it's a health center, whether it's a community center, whether it's a small, farming practice. So I just wanted to jump in there and say that.
Right. And I think that that leads us right into our next question. But before we get into that, thank you all in the chats for your wonderful insights, your inputs. Keep it coming. To any of the panelists that want to jump in, just make sure that you're replying to everybody, and not just hosts and panelists as well. So the next question is, what changes do you think need to happen to demonstrate a serious reckoning with white supremacy and colonialism in philanthropy and fundraising sector? And if you're comfortable with sharing, what do you think folks need to appreciate about the personal toll this work takes on yourselves? Well, that's a great question. So I'll repeat it one more time. What changes do you think that need to happen to demonstrate a seriousness and challenging, or a serious reckoning with white supremacy and colonialism in the philanthropic and fundraising sector? And what is the personal toll this is taking for folks like yourself, but others in the sector as well? Kris, you want to go first?
Sure. In the work that we do with the Circle on Philanthropy, we serve two primary member audiences, and our most important audience are Indigenous organizations, nations, communities, and grassroots movements. And our secondary member audience is the settler philanthropic sector. And the programming work that we do comes from the wisdom of Indigenous organizations and individuals who say, I might be interested in getting some of that settler philanthropic money, but could you make it a little less harmful for me before I do it? Could you make it so that I'm getting less, ridiculous questions about, can I touch your hair? And, can you give me a spirit name? Could you actually just make sure that first and foremost that settler philanthropic organizations have done at least some modicum of labor to demonstrate they could be in a different quality of connection and relationship with us? And so much of our early programming was really centered around that. It was centered around how do we find and identify the skill sets and capacities of individuals in the sector, but also of institutions and of family foundations who have a track record of thinking and doing things differently. And that track record is usually demonstrated by things like, can you retain Indigenous or racialized and Black staff or not? Do you have a history of long-standing relationships to Indigenous communities where you live, where you operate? Can you have an honest conversation about the origin of your wealth and work to create reparations? Can you speak openly about where your investments are doing less harm to the earth, to humans, to children? Those are the kinds of conversations that I think are really helpful in this space. Now, the toll, the conversation about the toll that it takes, I mean, the last week that I just had off was due to this really beautiful reciprocal relationship with my governing board, where I have what's called a seasonal sabbatical. So I have 1 week every season of the year So 4 times a year, 1 week, when I return back home to my communities, when it's safe, when it's not in the middle of a COVID outbreak or wildfire or flooding, or when the roads haven't washed out because of climate change, that I'm allowed to go home and spend a week at home. And the reason for that is because my indigeneity, me being a Secwepemc woman in this work, is a contributing factor to the success of this organization, undeniably. My worldviews help embed a way of being and a wisdom into how we do our work that deepens the relationships, the accountabilities, and the programming we have to offer. I can only get that kind of nourishment and rejuvenation to lead in this way when I have the opportunity to be home. Now, many folks will say, well, why don't you just use your vacation time to go home? Well, because if any of you know what it's like to be an eldest daughter to go back home to the res, then what you know is it's not really rest. You are bombing around your aunties to wherever they want to go. You are picking up kids. You're bringing them to the lake. You're doing grocery drop-offs. You're doing all of the things that are required to be part of and enmeshed in community. And that's still an important part. It's me being present. I can hear my language. I can practice my language with my family members. So the toll is very huge. And I think that more organizations could support Indigenous folks by creating cultural leaves and sabbaticals so that we can be rejuvenated and nourished. We can be filled back up, because the work that we do here in the sector, I'll tell you right now, it is not fairly or adequately compensated. And that our leadership has a higher level of expectation and a higher level of scrutiny than the leadership of white men in this sector and the leadership of other folks. And so I think that should be a topic of conversation. How do you create space and opportunity to support women like Germaine and Janine and myself in the sector to thrive, not to just be like running on fumes here? So I wanted to share that piece.
Absolutely. And to the other panel, the same question. Germaine, if you want to go ahead first.
Yeah, for sure. I can relate to a lot of that, especially the physical, the toll. Like, it can be physical. There are so many times when I'm having to, and I can choose not to, but I usually choose to, is dispelling myths about Indigenous people. Often will leave me with a headache at the end of the day. And I really have to, in this work, make sure that I have my own self-care strategies to combat it, because it's really draining. And at the end of the day, you can't, or for myself anyway, I can't check out from the work. Like, it's just, the roles that I have had have been around, they've been, Indigenous led, non-Indigenous led, but it's always been around Indigenous issues. So it's just not like you can't check out from this work. And then thinking about, what could change. I would love to see more leadership opportunities for Indigenous folks in this sector. I am also thinking about things like mentorship, and at the same time, I hesitate with the idea of mentorship because I have a hard time asking for help and support. But having said all that, it's really nice that I know people like Kris and Janine now, and many others in the sector. So we do all kind of support each other in a lot of ways. But yeah, I would say, and especially early in my career, I found that I didn't know how to look after myself. I wasn't prepared for what was in store for me in my career. Without going into too much detail or anything, there were people that I had encountered before that, would say things like, well, residential school wasn't that bad. And I would think like, no, actually, my dad was a residential school survivor, and that was not right of, folks that I had met early in my career who had those types of beliefs. And now I have more confidence. I have a lot more confidence in myself that it's okay to set your boundaries with donors or supporters rather, and just protect, like I keep saying, protect your spirit in this work.
Oh, I have so much to say. I'm so happy that Kris and Germaine went first. So they covered up a lot of points. a lot of very important points. You know, not only is the philanthropic sector dominated by white supremacy, white people, but, you know, fundraising is too. And it's, you know, it's going to take a lot of policy shifts, and that's public policy, that's organizational policy, to really make these professions, these spaces more, you know, diverse but safe. A lot of us are doing this work. We're doing it alone. Well, we're doing it in you know, in an organization with fellow fundraisers, with, you know, other folks in the philanthropic sector. But when you're the only Indigenous person in a room, on a board, in a organization, it is lonely. It is very lonely. So, you know, you need those circles to keep yourself strong. And I'm so grateful for the numerous Indigenous women in these sectors who have, you know, reached out. Like, I can tell you that I belong to a couple of very informal circles. One is Indigenous Women in Philanthropy, and we just kind of started emailing and saying, hey, you want to get together? And, you know, we meet virtually. There is another circle of Indigenous fundraisers, and we're very diverse. And I don't just mean that we're from different nations and different regions and territories, but we are in, you know, we could be working for a national charity, a non-Indigenous charity, an Indigenous charity, a grassroots org. And, you know, we kind of support each other and talk, like, you know, about these things that we've been talking about today, language, you know, and shifting from donor-centric to community-centric. And, you know, also, how are you fundraising for this holiday or that holiday? Like, it's being an Indigenous fundraiser and having to either be expected to perform your indigeneity or to share your trauma story or that of your family. You know, I can tell you that I'm very comfortable with sharing about my family's journey, or how residential school has affected us, or how poverty has affected us, or how assimilation and urbanization has. Not everybody's that comfortable, but I can still tell you, despite my willingness to share my story, to generate awareness, it is exhausting. And sometimes it's unexpected. And those unexpected days are the ones that are the hardest, and you need the most self-care. So in that regard, like, you know, acknowledge that your Indigenous team members have this extra burden. Also, the associations, the professional associations need to acknowledge that residential school put Indigenous wealth back generations. Most of us will not have an inheritance. Most of us have had to pay our own way through school because, contrary to popular belief, again, another stereotype, we didn't all get it paid for. We didn't get our educations paid for. I can tell you that, you know, I had about $90,000 in student loans. That is a very difficult thing to have as a single mom, and then trying to come up with $500 a year for a membership for my profession's membership. Am I going to buy groceries for a week, or am I going to, you know, buy into this membership? We deserve access, equitable access to learn as, you know, in our professions with our fellows. And so I hope that there are folks on this call who are from like AFP or the Canadian Gift Planners Association who are really taking into consideration moving beyond, you know, claims of standing in allyship with us or land acknowledgements, and actually putting their money where their mouth is to support those of us in the professions and for making space for people to enter it. I know the AFP used to have a fellowship for diversity and inclusion. It lasted like 2 years. A couple of great Indigenous fundraisers went through the program, like Sharon Red Sky and Sarah Madonic, and then there was nothing. I found this out because I was looking for it. I wanted to apply. So, you know, just like Germaine said, you know, not just membership, not just mentorships, but fellowships also. And yeah, I just, you know, I want to shout out to the partners in reciprocity. Laidlaw Foundation is going through this year's cohort, and the staff asked me to participate. So I've been going through that journey with them. You know, I think people just need to be very intentional about how they, support Indigenous folks in the sector, and how they break down, barriers for entry, for inclusion, but also, be real with yourself, look in the mirror. I know that it was a very difficult journey for Laidlaw about 10 years ago, maybe less, 8, to unpack where their wealth came from. And then to have the family members sit with the private members and talk about that. But if you don't acknowledge where your wealth comes from, you can't really steer it where it needs to go, in my opinion. I just have to say, I am the eldest child. I've just spent a week up north. Before I jumped on this call, I was running around telling my aunties and my son, okay, turn off the TV, don't knock on the door. Meanwhile, we're leaving at 3 o'clock and I'm still trying to pack the car and, thanks for that chuckle, Kris. It's just, it's too relatable.
Thank you. And I really like this question, so I'm gonna go rogue and give my own perspective as well, which is that our moment of white consciousness is come and gone, and that if the philanthropic sector is serious about demonstrating the type of changes that we need, there needs to be changes in bylaws, there needs to be changes in governance, and most importantly, you cannot withdraw from this conversation that we are in this moment of a philanthropic reckoning. And yes, I am talking about you, Calgary Foundation. Now, follow up to that question, there's over 10,000 philanthropic entities in Canada. There's about 86,000 charities in this country. I personally think we should be working with, or we that are change makers or implementing change or social change in the sector should be working with those charities to give them a better understanding of what changes they need to make, from their fundraising practices to their donor accepting practices to the way that they engage with community. So what do you think that charities can and should be doing to make their organizations safer for their Indigenous colleagues, including those of Indigenous fundraisers?
I've got an easy answer. First, stop applying for dollars to run programs on behalf of Indigenous or other racialized and marginalized communities, and support those organizations which really do actually exist, to gain those dollars, to run their own programs, to sustainably hire their own staff, and to pay fantastic wages and benefits and care to those folks. I think really, there's probably lots of back and forth we can have about the value of supporting the engagement of Indigenous or other equity-seeking folks inside of these institutions. But I really feel that my desire would be to see Indigenous institutions built up so that we're no longer the single Indigenous person on a board, the single Indigenous person working in an organization. I want to put my brain to use for an Indigenous-led organization and for Indigenous-led efforts and transformation. I actually don't want to play around the edges of helping white folks do better, think better, if I have to do it alone inside of an organization. I want to do it alongside my peers inside of the institutions that we build. And I really think that more and more charitable organizations could be thinking long and hard as well about whether or not it's time for them to put themselves to bed. The notion of, deciding to become a charity during a moment in time when it might have made sense and there wasn't an opportunity for organizations to be created. It makes sense that there's lots of folks who were serving Indigenous peoples, because until the 60s, Indigenous peoples weren't allowed to hire lawyers or to gather in groups. No wonder why we don't have institutions that go back like some of the other ones in this country. We legally were not allowed to convene, to hire lawyers, to register organizations, to be charitable, for example. And so I think that's one of the things that comes up. The other thing is stop making DEI a flash in the pan program. It needs to be part of your operational dollars. And I think that that's a really key piece. Often if folks want to do that work with us, but it's a program or a kind of thing that they want to do just once, we don't even entertain the conversation. If you're not going to be in a learning accompaniment relationship with the circle for 3 to 5 years, we don't want anything to do with it, because it's going to be not only a waste of our time, labor, and energy, but we know that it's not going to take. It's just going to be wait till you get some new board members, wait till you get new senior leadership, and then all of that work is undone and it defeats the purpose and harms morale. So those are a couple of things that I would add to this. So, for organizations who are doing a lot of good work on behalf of equity-seeking communities, figure out what you can do to take the resources and the assets and move them to those organizations who are led by those communities, and shut down and get out of the way.
Germaine.
Yeah, miigwech, Kris, for your powerful words, especially at the end. That's right, get out of the way. I guess I can kind of speak to like how things could be made safer is educate yourselves. Don't rely on Indigenous staff to do that work and put out the emotional labor, and recognize that for those of us that are in this sector, we have to work 10 times harder than anybody else to get to where we need to be. Is a big thing that comes to mind for me. And I would say also recognizing that Indigenous folks that are in this sector, we're all very different. So what might be a good strategy for an organization to try to make spaces safer, like what might work for me might not be what would not work for Janine or Kris, for example. Like we're all very diverse. So making sure that there's not a pan approach when coming up with strategies, I think is really something that really comes to mind. And yeah, just the education part, like, for me, if at some point when somebody says, well, residential schools, like they weren't so bad, well, it would be really helpful if someone else stepped in and supported me, with saying, no, that's not true. Especially being the daughter of a survivor, I get really passionate about those types of experiences. It's just, I almost feel like a lot of it can be common sense. Yeah.
I just have a couple of things to add. One, if we're talking about making, white private philanthropic foundations safer, one of the things that Laidlaw does, and I can't take credit for this pre-existed before my time, is that it is in the bylaws that a majority of seats go to the public and not the family members. So, they never have a majority say in the governance of the foundation. I think more private foundations need to be like that so that the governance is steered by community members, non-family members. And I've heard through the grapevine that there are a handful of family foundations who are doing just that, writing themselves out of the bylaws with recent updates. And that's a way to get out of the way. Sometimes it's unrealistic to spend down because you just have more impact when you don't touch the principle and you just give out, the additional. And so if that's the case, put the public in the captain's chair, and get out of the way. With the Indigenous-led organizations, yes, let's see more support for the Indigenous-led organizations that exist, but also support for the ones that should exist and do not yet. And so with that, I have to say the not-for-profits, the NGOs that have sprung up to try solve Indigenous or First Nations issues, this is not your work. And so when you have teams of fundraisers competing against Indigenous-led organizations or grassroots efforts, you are not acting in allyship with us. You are acting, in combat and competitiveness. I am sick and tired of making my little Twitter threads about how and who you can support that is Indigenous-led in Canada. I've done it on Thanksgiving. I've done it on Giving Tuesday. I recently done it when there was a major GoFundMe in support of a non-Indigenous organization claiming to clean First Nations drinking water. I've gotten a lot of, angry DMs by, you know, people who run these organizations saying, but we have an Indigenous Advisory Council. You have a council that you might go to for advice on this or that, but you did not have them in your leadership capacities. And, you know, that's, if, you know, get out of the way, pay us, don't just tokenize us in these, you know, these council seats. And I think that's it. I just looked at the clock, it's 3 o'clock.
Well, we got time, Well, this actually, you kind of addressed a bit of it, but as president of Laidlaw Foundation, you're the first Indigenous person to occupy that role in a private foundation in Canada. Beyond some of the stuff that you shared right now, what other policy changes is Laidlaw implementing to make you and your colleagues' governance space more representational?
So that question comes a little premature because we've gone through so much that September is when we're picking up the governance, and we're going full tilt with the governance committee to make sure that a lot of the culture, a lot of the actions that we do are really captured, you know, and they have institutional life and breadth. You know, one of the things we do in recruitment is that we have, you know, we don't just ask you for your interest and your resume. We want you to do a self-evaluation. What is your knowledge of Indigenous folks? What is your knowledge of, you know, Black community or you know, we get people to self-identify and rate themselves, you know, and that complements the conversation we have with them about their knowledge in the sector. And so fast forward, what we want to do is start, you know, capturing our, I don't want to call it diversity stats, but like who's who, like who's on board, who has been on board, what's the historical look? Because, you know, when you put it to paper, it's much different than, you know, speaking about it. And so I believe Kris could probably speak better to this. You know, there's a movement about having organizations, you know, declare who's on the board. This happens with, you know, government, you know, employment and boards, but it doesn't happen in this sector. The philanthropic sector has not a lot of transparency. Oh no, there's an Amber Alert in Ontario. Sorry. Yeah, just, you know, there's internal policies, there's external policies, but yeah, I want to know who's on the board. How many women, how old are they? You know, I want to know their gender diversity, community diversity. And I want to hear explanations as to why they don't have folks who they're serving on their boards.
Absolutely, and I know the Senator Rana Omnivar has been doing some work around that, so go check out the Senator's work around that to legislate non-for-profit organizations, sharing those statistics. Kris, often projects and initiatives get proposed in a go-forward way, but do not do anything to address the legacy of colonialism, inequity, and genocide. Do you think there's a role for philanthropy in restitution by the ways of reparations to individuals, communities, and nations? I know
the answer. Heck yes. Heck yes, there is. I think that's a natural kind of connect as well to what Janine was talking about, our Learning for Action tool, which is connected to the Philanthropic Communities Declaration for Action. I have this handy little mouse pad that talks about the Declaration for Action, which was created back in 2015 by a community of settler philanthropic organizations and Indigenous folks in the space who said, you know, we might not have been named in the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, but we recognize that the philanthropic sector could play a role. And so we promised to action these 94 calls to action. And so they created a really beautiful document. It's very nicely written, and a bunch of people signed it, and it went into one of the treasure boxes at the final gathering in 2015. And then people kind of went about their way, went about their business. In today's language, we would call that performative allyship, because signing a piece of paper and walking away is not actually action. And so all that to say, the good news story out of this is, is that the Declaration for Action, as we conceive of it now, is an opportunity for people to do reflection and to think about both individual and team-based leadership development. And so we have a tool which is called the Learning for Action tool. And so we have all these questions about how many dollars are going to Indigenous-led organizations, not to Indigenous benefiting organizations, because the CRA doesn't create opportunities for an accurate reporting of that data currently, and has, no demonstrated intention to do it soon. So we have to, at the Circle, gather the data ourselves and create the systems to gather that data. But additionally, we ask questions related to demographics, to investment strategies. We ask people questions like, are you aware of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action? And how often is this part of a conversation, or is it part of the strategic plan of an organization? And so I think that what we discover over time is that people have good intentions and they don't have a whole lot of clarity about how to actually activate on those good intentions. And so the Learning for Action tool is in its second year. We're really excited to see the results. The results from last year's cohort will be shared at our feast in October. So we would invite people to come and check that out and learn more about that. One of the things that is something to really consider is we get folks who show up at our door saying, we want to create a new grant stream for Indigenous peoples, or we want to do a fundraising campaign for Indigenous organizations. And our first question is there an organization that currently exists that you could give the money to? Instead of doing a whole new thing and putting your own name on it, your own brand, who is doing something else that is Indigenous-led that you can actually just give the money to and get out of the way? So that's something that we encourage often. We also encourage organizations to give to Indigenous-led or Indigenous and settler partnership organizations who are doing pooled grant making. Because again, don't go out and try and create it anew. Respect the fact that many relationships and much labor has already been done to create and activate these kinds of pooled fund opportunities, and donors can give. And then last but not least, I also just want to share that it becomes really important for folks, especially in the charitable sector, to understand for themselves personally, but also because they could be allies and share it with their family members, help people understand why many Indigenous and other racialized and Black-led organizations actually don't have charitable status. Charitable status would require you to not speak publicly beyond a very minimal percentage of your work about things that the government is doing that could be causing harm. So, for example, if you have land protectors or water protectors who are speaking actively against federally, mandated and financially supported resource extraction efforts, you're probably not going to get charitable status in this country. The other thing is, we've spoken publicly about this, the CRA needs to learn a thing or two about understanding Indigenous governance and recognizing the difference between behaving like a municipality versus actually behaving with our sovereignty as nations. So we also really encourage people to give non-receivable gifts, to understand that unless you're, happen to be in the income bracket where you gain a financial benefit from giving a certain amount of money and you have the privilege to do that, individual donors have a lot to offer. And not only are they willing to offer unrestricted, non-receivable gifts, they also seem to be, for us at least, to be the most progressive, and they're willing to have conversations, and they're willing to show up to the front lines. They're willing to be present in ways that are actually more helpful than the donor who wants a private little tour out at the fish camp.
Germaine, the FoodShare team was telling me that from today's RSVP list, they can see a lot of folks who are joining us that are fundraisers. What hope can you take away from this discussion and that they can apply to their work within fundraising and development?
I think a big part of that for me would be just continue to keep in mind that we are doing the same type of work. We are fundraising, but we all experience it very differently, and to honor that. and keep the conversations going. Like I would love to see more of these types of events, and I would love to hear from new fundraisers. I don't want to call myself an old fundraiser, but people that are new in the sector. I'd love to see people amplifying and supporting Indigenous fundraisers. And also, I hope that people just continue to be authentic and keep learning. I know for myself as a fundraiser, I've been doing this since 2016, that there's always something to learn in this sector, and that I'll never consider myself an expert or anything like that. That's just not me. But that's what I really enjoy about fundraising, is just you get to keep on learning, like just keep up with it. That's what I would hope anyways.
Thank you. We have some time for some more questions. I have a lot of questions. They're going to be dramatic, but we'll get into that. The first question from the audience is, can any of the panelists speak a little bit about the relationship between mutual aid versus receivable donations?
The first thing that comes up for me is, mutual aid is done in relationship. And I think that if you already have relationships where mutual aid is available to you to participate in, then certainly support it. I think one of the things that I would just add that I don't want to lose in this conversation is that there are times when transaction is important and where transformation is desired. I actually am not interested in some like deep, meaningful relationship with a funder for less than $150,000 because it's going to take up too much of my time and energy. I want a transaction. I tell you what I'm going to do. You give me the money, get out of my way. I give you the report. We're done. Thank you very much. I think when I think about transformation, I am thinking about longer term systems and institutional change where we're seeing an actual shift in the power and that more of the leadership in the space is happening by Indigenous folks. Until such a time, there are going to be people who want to be in the space of being in deep relationship, in mutual aid, in reciprocity. And my first question is has that been invited? Or are you just co-opting language that you think is the right language to use? What you're actually talking about is a transaction. So transactions are not bad things. I actually can really appreciate a cash or a grant-based transaction. You're going to give me this thing, I'm going to give you that. We're good, we're done, it's clear. Now, will you do it in ways that can be a real pain in my ass? Absolutely. But I have some agency here about what I'm willing to agree with. But I also, and what we support our Indigenous members to do, is to push back, to say to an organization, hey, you signed the philanthropic declaration, you say you want to do something differently. Here's a chance for you to do something differently. Offer a grant outside of your grant making application process, offer a different amount of grant for a longer amount of time for a larger pot of money, etc. Now, this conversation transformation. Now, I'm interested in transforming the sector, but it's going to come at a cost. And that cost is going to be a cost that will take into consideration the emotional and spiritual costs of me and my team. And it will take into consideration the amount of time that true transformation takes. And it will take into consideration that not only you're getting an amazing convening partner and a learning accompaniment opportunity here, but you are also needing to require and demonstrate change through all levels of an organization. I don't want to just hang around with one champion in your organization. I got to know you've got champions in your board, in your senior leadership, all the way down to the person who's answering the telephones and directing calls. So I just didn't want to lose that. We were talking earlier about language, and folks really want to be all about like partnership. Don't pretend that what you want to do is a partnership or as transformation. If it's a transaction, transactions are fine. Just don't pretend it's not what it is.
Absolutely.
I just want to jump back to the question that Germaine was answering, and that there was a lot of fundraisers on the call today, and offer some concrete support examples. So, if you're working with Indigenous fundraisers, I've found that in the many roles I've had with United Way and other places, that I'm often tapped on the shoulder. I'm often asked for that 5 minutes. I get that email, like, can you help? I don't mind, but know that every 5 minutes adds up. And know that I am not going to support you until I know that you've tried to help yourself. So, do put your best foot forward, do your desktop research, call in other people. And these include things like sensitivity reading, quality checks of your work, copy editing for Indigenous style guiding, and resource sharing. Like, a lot of these things you can source for yourself online. So don't drop into the inbox until you've actually tried to do that for yourself. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I think this goes for, working with any Indigenous person in any industry. And so, and I also wanted to say, with the Declaration of Action, Kris mentioned about, those that signed it, giving outside of their funding priorities. I have leveraged the Declaration many times to say, I know you don't fund healthcare, but you signed the Declaration. And so, and I want to say that a lot of signatories are really responsive in saying, yeah, you're right. And yeah, let's hear what it is that you're proposing. And so yeah, it is that leverage of the Declaration exists. I just wanted to throw that out there before we jump to the next question, Yonis.
No, thank you. Need to get anything to say additional? No.
I wanted to just add to that too, thinking about those 5 minutes of, do you have a quick second? But also for me, what I found is people assume things about me. And I know there's a balance between don't assume things or make decisions that are going to impact me, like without my consent. I mean, that sounds so straightforward, but a lot of times I have to tell people, like, you don't have to assume. Sometimes it is okay to ask a question, but again, yes, of course, do your research and spend that time beforehand. But I've been in a lot of situations where people have assumed things. So just wanted to add that.
Got one question. It's a little messy, might not be. We'll figure it out. As you know, philanthropy currently, the laws in Canada, the Income Tax Act, allows for philanthropic resources to exist in perpetuity. Should philanthropy, or settler Canadian philanthropy, be allowed to exist in perpetuity? And does that conflict with Indigenous and First Nation practices and approaches?
My gut reaction is like, no, the notion of perpetuity is all a myth. In the way in which settler philanthropy behaves, I would say that what is happening in perpetuity is hoarding and greed is happening. That is not a demonstration of generosity. When I see more money sitting in bank accounts than more money being granted, I think that there is a very deep imbalance, and my teachings tell me, and our laws demonstrate, that actually the behavior of hoarding and greed, that kind of imbalance, must have a balancing impact, and it's not always a good one. And so I think that communities such as Indigenous communities and others who've worked for many years to tend to and take care of their well-being, we know a heck of a lot more about the ethical stewardship of resources and about how we actually can redistribute the wealth. To be frank, settler philanthropy is a baby in this space. You've only been around for a couple hundred years at most, and you can barely talk about the origin of your wealth and barely consider reparations and spending down on capital. So I actually don't think that it's well suited for in perpetuity, because that notion is actually just demonstrating a practice of hoarding and greed, which I find very concerning.
I just want to echo, similar to what Kris said, what we're talking about with perpetuity is the perpetuation of scarcity, and it promotes competition, you know, and it's in contrast to the abundance that we know to exist in Canada, that, you know, Indigenous folks, you know, have shared this abundance with settlers, newcomers for time immemorial. And, you know, when we hoard the money, when we hoard the assets, that's a violation to, you know, the spirit in which we welcomed people into this land. And, you know, it's hoarding versus generosity, scarcity versus abundance. And so for me, yes, it is a contrast to how, you know, Indigenous folks are, you know, with each other, with settlers. And, you know, there's the spend down, there's a couple of different conversations, right? There's the existing private foundations and the spend down. And, you know, instead of granting it out, what we could be doing is transferring the assets to, you know, historically displaced communities. Laidlaw Foundation recently transferred a portion of our assets to the Foundation for Black Communities and Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. That's something that's virtually unheard of in this sector, and it should be more commonplace. And so that's, I mean, I want folks to know that it's not commonly done. So when these two communities, you know, historically disadvantaged or, you know, who, you know, have been set back wealth-wise because of, you know, how we came to this land or how people came to our land, you know, I think that's a powerful thing, and more people need to do it, because the people who you're trying to grant to with the 30,000 here, the 20,000 there, they know what's best for their community, and they know that what they need is not $30,000 a year. So put the wealth in the hands of the people that need it the most, and the people who know the answers to their, you know, to the issues that they face. Yeah.
All right, last question. It's a beautiful Wednesday afternoon. So let's make time for joy and rest. So we would like to know what you guys are doing to bring joy, rest, relaxation, happiness to your lives these days. Germaine, you want to go first?
Sure. I thought of probably, I don't know, like a million things. I tried to write down things that do bring me joy, just for when I need that reminder. That's a great question. I would say, I love being out on my patio. I've been enjoying new music. I am taking some time, hopefully this month, to go home, to go north. This is a plan that's happening. And yeah, just being grateful for everything. Yeah. I'm done. Any question?
Janine?
Oh, it's a great question. I don't think I have a great answer, because I'm terrible at pushing myself to the limits. And it's something that I've learned as an eldest child, as a single mom. But I can say that, you know, I forced myself to take some time off. I've come back to my territory, to my First Nations, and one of the things that just recently brought me joy was making time for family, and taking my 70-year-old auntie home. She hasn't been home in almost 20 years. And visiting our ancestors, like literally going to the graveyard, cleaning it, bringing new flowers, and having my, you know, my matriarchs walk me from headstone to headstone to headstone to say, this is where your grandmother is, your great-grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, and to have my son with me, you know, and I know it might sound morbid, especially from a Western context, to be, you know, hanging out in the graveyard and stuff like that, but that, you know, with that came stories, you know, learning who I was named, learning the characteristics of the grandmother I was named after, and the, you know, learning people's birth dates, death dates, whether they served in the military, things like that, that we don't really take time to reflect on. And so that was an experience I, you know, created for myself this weekend, and something I'm going to try to incorporate in my life more often. And yeah, just getting home more. I don't drive, so I'm really dependent on other people with cars. So I'm going to get my license as a form of self-care so that I can get the heck out of Dodge, also known as Toronto, whenever I want to. So yeah.
My joy is found in the lakes of my home territories. Nothing fills me up more than getting into the water. But speaking of licenses, I got my learner's motorbike license earlier this year in the spring. And so that is one of the things that I'm looking forward to that's been bringing me lots of joy. I have a motorcycle and I need to get to riding it. And so that I think will bring me loads and loads of joy. So I'm looking forward to that. Sure.
Well, thank you all, Janine, Germaine, Kris. It's been an honor sharing the space with you today, learning from you guys, from your lived experiences, your expertise and your knowledge. I'm a strong believer in communities of shared oppression have shared futures. With over $120 billion of philanthropic resources, with over 86,000 charities in this country, we have the capacity, we have the resources, we have the intellect, and we have the will to see the change that we want to be. It's a nonlinear process, but majority of this work should have an end date. And I'm grateful for your wisdom. Shout out to the FoodShare team behind the scenes who are making this event run really, really smoothly. Renee, Jenny, Andrea, Peter, thank you all. Thank you to our speakers, Germaine, Janine, Kris, thank you. And please take a minute to follow all their organizational links and check out their work. It'll be in the chat. And keep up to date to FoodShare's upcoming events at FoodShareTO on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Anyways, hope you guys have a fantastic